Today, I'm stepping out of my comfort zone and delving into a topic I'll admit to not knowing a lot about. So please bear with me. Medical aids and funding for medical costs to me is a hugely intimidating world of options, benefits I'll admit I don't understand, and the pressure once a year to make a decision that honestly for me feels like it's based on fear. And now we add the implementation of national health insurance. With me today is Craig Comrie, the chairperson of the Health Funders Association, or HFA, who I'm hoping will shed some light on the current landscape of medical cost funding. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, and good to be with you.
Medical schemes remain a very important safety blanket, both for those who can afford to pay for membership privately or as part of their employment or retirement benefits. People often speak about medical aid as a grudge purchase. Perhaps you could talk us through the financial protection medical schemes provide and how this works in a not-for-profit structure.
Maybe let's start at the not-for-profit structure. Medical schemes are owned by the members of medical schemes, so probably very similar to what a pension fund looks like, but that's where the similarities actually change. So the difficult thing is when you invest in or you save in a pension fund, you're hoping for one day for it to be sufficient when you retire. Medical schemes, however, are there for the now. It's for your claim or your medical need that you need tomorrow. And so often felt like a grudge purchase, but speak to the members where they've incurred expenses. And if they look at some of those expenses, some of them, 1 million, 10 million, we've had cases above 20 million rand. And this is about saving a life. So it's far more complicated than just a financial sum or a return on investment conversation. It's a personal investment in an individual's life. And so that's why we need to make sure the complexities around medical schemes don't just cause the fear, but remove the fear. And that's what you should be buying. You should be buying something that you know is going to help you, that if you need it, there is people that will care for you, and you're making that purchase often for your family as well. So it's a real responsibility for whoever's buying medical aid to know what you're purchasing.
So this year we've seen, me included, some steep contribution increases across the industry. With the Health Funders Association and the actuarial analysis you've been looking at, what are some of the factors that are driving the costs of belonging to a medical scheme?
The major factor that has a real impact on medical schemes is firstly the fact that the cost of living crisis that we've all experienced since the end of COVID has made a real dent in everybody's budgets. And so other than perhaps your mortgage on your house or your car, medical schemes premiums feature right there, depending on what your household looks like. So if it's 2 or 3 people, your next biggest debit order and what you pay in every month is your medical scheme contribution. And so it is a very real target when it comes to cost of living increases. And so what we have seen is that we have this thing called healthcare inflation, which always manages to outstrip CPI. It never has been under the normal CPI, just because it follows the trajectory of evidently a country who's suffering with a greater burden of disease, or what that often means from our clinicians, it means that we are getting, we're actually living longer, but we're carrying more chronic conditions. We suffer with things like obesity, people that have more hypertension and cardio-related issues. And so it is a lifestyle change that actually can drive better healthcare inflation. But as those things deteriorate, we are seeing more healthcare being needed. And so that has to be funded. And so instead of maybe a 4.4% inflation rate now, healthcare's inflation over the last 10 years has always operated at 3 to 4.5% above inflation. And mainly because of the fact that we're just not looking after ourselves, but we are living longer. And when we need it, we're landing up in hospital to save our lives rather than doing the daily habitual improvements in what we eat, how we sleep, and making sure that we move and exercise. So that adds to the healthcare inflation conversation, while the cost of living also actually adds to it as well. So as your salary or your income improves over time, it typically looks like inflation, normal inflation. When your medical scheme premiums go up by 8, or as we've seen this year, between 8 and 14%, what you do is you buy on price. You don't actually no longer look at what you need, but you buy something that could be classified as cheap and does not provide you with the right level of cover. But that is out of necessity. It's out of the fact that you've got these budgetary pressures. So it's something that, from a Health Funders Association, we're very wary of. We're very aware that often we see a huge buy down, people buying down from a comprehensive option to a very basic option, yet they carry all those chronic ailments with them where they actually need more cover. And so it is a big determining factor on why inflation increases. And then we can move into some of those, or health inflation increases. Some of the other things is there's some fantastic new technology in healthcare. If there's one area that moves very quickly in healthcare, it is the technology space. And so we've seen new drugs develop. There's a wonderful new drug developed in the US called Trikafta, and it's marvelous for the treatment of Alzheimer's, but it costs you $300,000 a year. So how do we keep up with funding these things that make a very real difference in our lifestyle and extending our life, but it also has a very real impact on the price of the care that we're getting, and that is what pushes some of the healthcare inflation as well.
Mm. It's quite scary, I have to say. The cost of medical coverage, and then, as you say, it's an immediate expense. It's not something like a retirement fund that, I can pop in today and kind of open it up in 20 years' time. So one has to balance, I suppose, the money that you're spending today versus the benefits that you may or may not claim in the upcoming year. So how do the benefits of medical scheme membership differ from the primary healthcare products that are now available?
Yeah, so the first place is there's a regulatory difference in the primary healthcare products, often referred to as health insurance products. So we've seen the health insurance market start off with very basic type of products, and you have to look very carefully at what they cover. They are still a for-profit insurance-based product. So the shareholders and the businesses that sit behind that obviously can make profits out of you, while in the medical scheme side, any surpluses left in the scheme are there to offset future claims and costs. And so that's one of the primary differences, but it has got to do a lot with the regulatory environment. So schemes are governed by the Medical Schemes Act, and the regulator is the Council for Medical Schemes. And so every year we have to register our rules, etc. And then there is a lowest level of benefit called prescribed minimum benefit, which is to provide the healthcare consumer or the member of the medical scheme assurances that there is quite a reasonable lowest level of benefit that you can access in the medical scheme space. While in the health insurance space, obviously they don't have to comply with that requirement, and so they can carve typically what is primary healthcare with a few extras under the insurance, under an insurance license. And that can be, the other thing is you can actually risk rate under those health insurance spaces, and often that's what happens. So if you're over 50 or over 60 again, you'll find a stepped approach in what is charged in the health insurance space. While in the medical scheme space, regardless of your age, you get charged the same rate, provided you get into medical schemes by the age of 35. So there are lots of dynamics when it comes to that, but you want to make sure that you avoid some of the late joiner penalties that happen in the medical scheme environment and get in there before the age of 35. So there are very real differences in the benefit structures, and you have to do the legwork. You have to get with the broker that's going to tell you exactly what you're buying, and make sure you read in the small print. It really is important to do that.
Craig, who's got time to read the small print? But you've touched on it, but you've touched on something that I've always kind of wondered about. PMBs, or prescribed minimum benefits, are they the same across all medical schemes?
It's prescribed minimum, benefit. Often
Yeah.
people mistake it for being a maximum benefit. It is a minimum benefit, but even in the way that medical schemes operate, it's quite an extensive benefit. So it does cover 25 chronic conditions. It makes sure that when you land up in hospital, probably more than 60 or 70% of all your hospital procedures are PMB related. There is a portion that isn't. And so it's another issue that with your scheme, if you're a member of the medical scheme, as you experience and need the benefit, make sure you're asking them and they will help you navigate the journey to understand PMBs. It's estimated that that PMB package alone in the industry costs anywhere between 1,200 to 1,600 Rand. And that's per beneficiary. So now you start to understand why medical schemes are considered expensive, and why the primary healthcare products or health insurance products are actually filling an affordability gap. So when an individual joins, some of those products are anywhere between 250 all the way to 1,500 or even more, depending on where they are positioned.
So, I mean, clearly there's still a tremendous need for medical schemes with the NHI light years away from beginning to even offer similar types of benefits. The NHI, I suppose, can be seen as a little bit controversial. So I'm interested in how are you as an industry body seeking to address the sustainability challenges medical schemes face?
Now, many people mistake the NHI as being the end of medical schemes. Even
Mm.
within the current NHI Act, which we do disagree with many parts of the Act, there is a space carved out for medical schemes to provide services and benefits that aren't included in the NHI benefit package. Now, practically, we believe that in the NHI package, you need to be able to fund that, and the funding is probably the biggest question that South Africans should have. Where does the funding come from to actually fund anything you want to put into NHI? But because of that funding restriction, we believe medical schemes will be able to provide quite a large, comprehensive set of benefits to members for a very, very long time. And I'm saying decades. I think it's going to be a very long time before we see the role of the medical schemes start to shrink. And it is based on how is the economy going in South Africa? What does the GDP look like? Pravin Gordhan is quoted at the start of the NHI conversation in the late 2000s. I think it was 2009. He said, unless we grow at 5% or more, we cannot afford NHI. And it's still true. It still holds true today. So we actually have to make sure that we grow the economy, that there's more money in the fiscus to then fund an NHI benefit package. And that's what we don't see those numbers in what's been shared about the NHI, but it certainly points to the fact that schemes are going to be sustainable into a very long time, and we think for the longest of times. Now, the NHI Act has driven lots of political debate, and certainly from a medical scheme perspective has brought a lot of criticism because these unanswered questions have never been provided to all that have participated in the NHI design process. NHI didn't just come in last year. It's actually been a 15-year consultation with the industry. So it's not as if the industry is unprepared or doesn't know what the NHI is trying to achieve. We support universal healthcare coverage. Absolutely. We need better healthcare in South Africa at an affordable rate as well. And so that objective is right. But how you get there is where we do differ with the current legislation. So there are currently invitations from the president to put forward a proposal on how we improve the health system. We'll do that. HFA is working alongside BUSA and others to support an alternative proposal to how the NHI envisages universal health care. On the other side, there is an act that has been written into law. And so alternatively, we will, and we have, put together a constitutional challenge, which will also drive a very interesting constitutional point in law, which talks specifically about the fact that individuals should be able to choose for themselves where they get healthcare, how they fund their healthcare. And so that part is actually restricted in the NHI Act, and that's where we think there's lots of conversation and even a court case that might need to decide on that.
It's a very complex conversation. If you think about the politics on the one hand, which you've already touched on, and healthcare being really a basic human right in our constitution, and you've mentioned the constitution, versus the the need and the kind of commerciality of it, it's an unenviable position. What's at stake in a single state-controlled fund as envisaged in the NHI Act in its current form?
Well, what is at stake is choice. And the problem is the NHI Act, it's a Section 33 of that Act, limits an individual to get financing through a medical scheme for benefits that the NHI provides. We actually think you need a competitor in that space. You need medical schemes to offer you an alternative choice. And if you're willing to purchase that, isn't that the freedom that you should experience? And so that's the freedom that drives the constitutional challenge. I think it's almost the reverse. It's very interesting, but the reverse analogy is probably Eskom. Now that we want to go into individual supplies of electricity, we're doing the reverse on the healthcare space. We want to centralize into one space every healthcare spend, and that's not right. We need to compare it to more efficient, better quality, parallel system that runs next to NHI, but still achieves universal healthcare. Now, you might think that it's a contradiction, but it's not. If you have medical schemes, and in fact, this is how medical schemes were designed, they were to remove the obligation off the state for a group of people who could actually pay for their own healthcare. So effectively, they've removed 9 million people out of the state responsibility of covering their cost. And these 9 million people are paying for it themselves. It's actually, it's an amazing thing. So in our alternative proposal, we're saying, why don't we try improve, and through a mandatory cover, meaning that if you're in formal employment, you should be covered by a private medical scheme. It was part of the design in the early 2000s. And so if you get more people into the private sector paying for their own healthcare, you relieve the burden currently sitting on the public sector. And so we don't believe schemes should be held out to be, it's only for those that can afford and be and are wealthy, etc. That's actually not the fact either. But it leaves the rest of that healthcare budget for the public sector to look after fewer people that cannot afford medical schemes. And so you can actually maximize both ends of the market, and that way you achieve universal healthcare coverage.
It's a very, very interesting perspective I hadn't thought of before. And so I guess in wrapping up our conversation today, how do you see the role of medical schemes potentially contributing to upholding standards in healthcare in the decades to come?
I think that role isn't for medical schemes to take. I think it's the role of every healthcare consumer. It's the demand side or the healthcare consumer that determines some of the standards. They know which doctors are the best doctors to go to. You only need to get feedback after a hospital event to understand that the consumer has the experience. That sometimes the medical schemes don't hold the full experience. They typically hold the funding experience, but not the experience of how they've experienced a doctor, a facility, a nurse. And so very quickly, the responsibility is not just a medical scheme responsibility. We've got huge amounts of data that can show us profiles, etc., but the members and the individual medical scheme consumer must actually have that responsibility themselves.
Well, the right to have access to healthcare services is a basic human right guaranteed in our constitution. But as Craig has shared with us today, some things are not as clear-cut as they appear to be, and there are some clear challenges. And I look forward to carrying on the NHI conversation with you, Craig, as it unfolds. And thank you for joining me on EBNet Stream to unpack some of the current thinking.
Happy to do that. Always available. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you very much.